So earlier, Rath spoke to Stephen Nagy. So he's the visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs and Politics and International Studies professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo. And he is also senior fellow at the MacDonald-Luria Institute and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Let's have a look.
Professor, with the White House confirming that China is building a new spy facility in Cuba, what does this mean for rising U.S.-China tensions?
It's not a surprise, I think, that China would be interested in building a spy station in Cuba. It gives them the opportunity to listen into discussions and in the United States. But I think it's also a tit for tat. The reality is that the United States does have a basis throughout the Indo-Pacific, providing the United States the same kinds of opportunities to listen into what's happening in China. So it's a tit for tat rather than, I think, an escalation. But I don't think it bodes well for bilateral relations. Again, I think this will be seen as not something that the Biden administration cannot push back against, which may cause some more tension in the relationship. As we saw with the balloon saga in late 2022, there was just no way for the Biden administration to not respond, which disrupted the opportunity for conversation and for Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, to visit Beijing to try and create some pathways for cooperation.
What new developments do you expect from?
Well, I think dialogue is always important. What we've seen is a succession of dialogue between Chinese counterparts and American counterparts. For example, Jake Sullivan met his counterpart Wang Yi, and they discussed some substantive issues between the two states. In terms of trying to draw their red lines, provide a clear understanding where they sit in terms of those key issues. And of course, one of the biggest key issues is Taiwan. The United States are consistent that their one China policy has not changed, that they prioritize peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits. But Beijing sees this differently. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's discussions with Wang Yi about trying to discuss the core issues in the relationship, and that is Taiwan, to try to talk about technology curbs on the Chinese economy, potentially talk about some areas of cooperation. And here I'm thinking of climate change, perhaps diplomatic cooperation, coordination to try and convince Vladimir Putin to pull out or to withdraw from his invasion of Ukraine. And I do think there's some other areas where the United States and China can potentially build some dialogue. Really, the ball is not in the Washington's court. It's really in Xi Jinping's court. I think that Beijing is feeling very insecure right now. They're feeling surrounded by the United States and its allies. They're feeling the coordinated diplomacy that the Biden administration has provided in the region by strengthening alliance partners, putting forward, I think, very visionary legislation such as the CHIPS Act. And as we saw just last week, an announcement about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And it's this collective, sequential, and systematic approach to diplomacy and pressuring China to change some of its behavior that I think Beijing would like to find ways to de-escalate so it can stabilize its economy.
You spoke about Balloon Gate, and do you feel that this incident could actually blow up into what we saw in Balloon Gate, given that the U.S. elections are coming next year and that U.S. administrations both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, have the urge to appear to be harder on China?
What I'm very relieved about in the United States is that we're seeing prominent op-eds such as Jessica Chen Weiss and others in the New York Times and the Washington Post talking about the need for a more rational, less confrontational, more synergistic diplomatic approach to dealing with China. They keep trying to send the message that China is not a 10-foot giant. Rather, it is a fragile superpower, as Susan Shirk has written in many of her writings, and that a wise politician, an experienced politician, should be able to prevent another balloon gate from occurring in the wake of these spy stations being placed in Cuba, and finding other ways to pressure Beijing or to remove the spy stations. It's really important that we continue to have cool-headed approach to dealing with China. We don't want to spiral into accidental conflict, and we don't want to create the conditions where nationalism in China creates internal pressures on Xi Jinping and his ruling clique to do something much more provocative across the Taiwan Straits. I think also we should also look at how Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, and I think privately in Taiwan as well, are sending signals to Washington and the Biden administration that bluster is not the only way to deal with China. That there's a need to de-escalate relations because of the economic codependencies that exist within the region. And despite the real challenges that exist between China and many of its neighbors, including the United States, that there's also very strong economic relationships that the neighbors of China need to negotiate and balance as they engage in their bilateral and collective relations with China.
Professor, with this continued tit for tat and the intertwined economic relationship between China and countries here in the Asia Pacific, are there any immediate challenges to Japan and Taiwan?
So I think the key priorities that continue to surface in Tokyo and of course Taipei is what is the direction of Beijing's policies towards Taiwan? Is it interested in a forced reunification? Is it willing to use gray zone tactics or operations and lawfare to achieve its national objectives? And I think cool-headed analysts seem to think that Beijing does prefer a peaceful reunification, and I know the expression in Taiwan is unification, that they're willing to wait. The problem is what we've seen in terms of behavior in the region, that in some ways Beijing has become more belligerent. The military exercises around Taiwan in August last year, the rhetoric about not reserving the right to use force, and even the recent defense minister's speech in the Shangri-La dialogue following Lloyd Austin's speech really sent the strongest of signals that Beijing is willing to use force. It sees the United States as being an alien country to the region, and China continues to send a signal that the region is its backyard. And for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries, they live in this region. The region is their backyard as well, and they are very concerned about Beijing's assertive behavior within the region, and they would like the United States to have a strong, anchored diplomatic, security, and economic presence within the region to ensure that peace and stability across the Taiwan states remains intact, that the status quo remains intact, and that the region's economic integration continues to proceed in a stable, rules-based, transparent, and prosperous way. And frankly, Beijing's actions are not bringing confidence to any of the players I just mentioned.